He brought me flowers exactly twice in 7 years of marriage. Once when I lost the pregnancy at 11 weeks, and once when I came home from my mother's funeral. So when I found a charge to Cedar Hill Florist, 6750, 3rd Sunday of October, on our visa statement, I did not immediately assume it was for me. I checked the date against my memory. That Sunday, I had been at a colleague's bridal shower in Barhaven, eating cucumber sandwiches and watching someone unwrap a KitchenAid. My husband, Jonah, had told me he was going to pick up some things from Canadian Tire and maybe watch the game. Not flowers. I scrolled back through the statement. September, 67.50 cents. August, 71.20. July, 67.50. June, May, April. The same charge, the same weekend of the month, going further back than I'd thought to check before. I set my coffee down on the kitchen counter and did not pick it up again. It went cold. I let it. My name is Tilda Norris. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I was not the kind of woman who went through her husband's phone. I had never even considered it. We had been together for 9 years, married for 7, and if someone had asked me the day before I found that statement whether I trusted Jonah, I would have said yes without pausing to think. He was steady in the way that some men are steady. Not exciting, not full of grand gestures, but consistent. He showed up. He called when he said he would. He remembered that I couldn't eat cilantro, and he never once ordered the wrong takeout. In the early years, that reliability had been enough. In the years after my mother died, it had been the only thing keeping me upright. My mother passed 3 years ago, May long weekend, from a cancer that moved fast enough that we barely had time to understand what was happening before it was over. She was 61. She had spent most of her life in a small town north of Sudbury, working as a school secretary, raising me alone after my father left when I was 4. She was not a woman who spoke much about the past. She loved Tim Hortons double-doubles and the leaves in her garden, especially the sunflowers she grew in rows along the back fence every summer, tall and slightly crooked, facing south. I do not know even now everything about who she was before she was my mother. I know that I did not have nearly enough time to find out, and I know that after she was gone, something in me went very quiet. I said nothing to Jonah about the visa statement. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I let myself feel anything about it. I went back through 14 months of statements, as far as the online portal let me. Every single month, 3rd Sunday, Cedar Hill Florist in Kanata. I googled the shop. It had a small website. Seasonal arrangements, custom orders, wreaths, the kind of place you'd go with something specific in mind, not somewhere you'd stop on impulse. I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. The 3rd Sunday of November came, gray and cold. Jonah told me he was having lunch with an old colleague from his site crew, a guy named Pete from Stittsville. I said that sounded good. Then I sat in our car 2 blocks from our house on McCarthy Road and waited. I followed him west on the 417 and then off into Kanata. He pulled into the parking lot of a long-term care facility called Meadowfield Gardens, a low brick building set back from the road with a stone path lined by cedar hedges and a small sign with the name in green letters. I watched him walk through the front entrance carrying a bunch of sunflowers wrapped in brown paper. I sat in my car for 40 minutes. When he came out, his hands were empty. I did not go inside that day. I drove home before he did, thawed a container of soup from the freezer, set the table. When he walked in and said dinner smelled good, I agreed that it did. There is a particular kind of calm that descends when you are holding a question you are not yet ready to ask. I had felt it once before, in a hospital waiting room with my mother, when a specialist asked us both to come into the office together. You already know something is wrong. You go very still. Over the following 2 weeks, I gathered information the same way I would approach a patient file that wasn't adding up, methodically, without letting myself jump to conclusions before I had the full picture. I found an archive charge from 16 months ago at a care supply store in Nepean. A fleece throw blanket and a pair of non-slip socks, the kind of purchase you make for someone you feel responsible for. I found a charge from 7 months ago at a pharmacy in Kanata on the same Sunday as the florist. I found nothing that looked like a hotel room. Nothing that looked like a restaurant for 2 somewhere I didn't know about. What I found looked like someone caring for an elderly person, regularly, deliberately for over 2 years. In some ways that made it harder, an affair I could have named. This I could not fit into any shape I already knew. I told my friend Bridget what I had found, not because I needed her to fix it, but because I needed to say it out loud to make it real. We sat in her kitchen in Barhaven over tea, and she listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Have you asked him?" she said. "Not yet." "Do you want to know, or do you want to have already known?" I sat with that question on the drive home. I was still sitting with it 3 days later. I tried calling the facility. The woman at reception was polite but firm. She couldn't confirm or deny whether any specific person was a resident, or whether they had any particular visitors. Privacy legislation. I understood. I worked at a dental practice. I knew how Pipedia operated. I thanked her and put the phone down. The third Sunday of December arrived. Jonah said he had some errands to run, that he'd probably stop for gas, that he'd be back by dinner. I said I was thinking of driving out to the Rideau Center. Then I went directly to Meadowfield Gardens and parked facing the entrance and sat with the heat running and watched the cedar hedge move in the wind. My mother would have told me to go inside. She was not a woman who sat in parking lots when she could be doing something useful. So I went inside. The woman at the reception desk was not the same one I'd spoken to on the phone. She was older, close to retirement, wearing a lanyard with a small enamel cardinal pinned to it, the way Ontario women of a certain generation pin things to lanyards. I told her I was looking for my husband, that he'd come to visit a family friend, and I'd meant to meet him here. I gave her Jonah's description. She looked up carefully from her desk and said, very quietly, that she couldn't give me any information about residents, but that the family lounge was just down the hall to the left if I wanted to wait. I thanked her and walked past the lounge. The corridor was warm and smelled of roast chicken and a pine cleaning product, and something underneath both of those that is simply the smell of long-term care. Not unpleasant, just specific. The smell of a place where time moves differently. Room numbers ran along the left side. From somewhere I could hear a television, and then, from a room partway down, a voice I knew so well I could have picked it out of a crowd. Jonah's voice. The door was slightly ajar. He was speaking in a tone I hadn't heard from him in some time. Unhurried, soft. The way he had spoken to me in the weeks after my mother died, when he would sit beside me on the couch with his hand on my back and not try to fix anything. I stopped walking. "I found the sunflowers at the same place in Kanata," he said. "They had to order them in again. Tilda doesn't know yet. I keep thinking I'll find the right moment to tell her, and then I can't figure out how to start." A pause. Then, "She's doing well, you'd be proud of her, she really is." I pushed the door open. The room was small and south-facing. Winter light came in flat through a window overlooking the cedar hedge. There was a single bed, a dresser with a few framed photographs on it, a chair pulled close to the bed where Jonah was sitting. In the bed, propped against two pillows, was a woman who appeared to be somewhere in her late 70s, with white hair cut close to her head and dark, sharp eyes that moved to me the moment the door opened. She looked at me the way someone looks at a photograph they have been keeping in a drawer for a long time. She said very quietly, "Matilda." Nobody had called me that since my mother died. Jonah turned around. He went completely still. "Tilda," he said. "Who is she?" I asked. He stood up slowly, as though he needed to be careful about it. "Her name is Nettie Gallagher. She worked as a community health nurse in Northern Ontario for almost 30 years, in a town called Chapleau." Chapleau. I had heard that word once, briefly, years before my mother got sick. She had mentioned it in passing, a place she'd been through, or near, she'd said, and then not mentioned again. I had not thought about it since. I sat down on the edge of the bed because I was not sure what my legs intended to do, and Nettie Gallagher reached over and placed her hand over mine, and over the next 2 hours, between the three of us, the whole story came out. My mother had been 19 years old and 5 weeks early when she went into labor alone in a rented room in Chapleau. It was the middle of January, the kind of January that makes the weather report on ZCBC, the kind that shuts down highways and keeps everyone indoors. She had no car. She had nobody nearby. She had walked to the small community clinic at the edge of town in the dark, and the nurse who had been called in that night was Nettie Gallagher, 28 years old, who had driven 40 kilometers on roads that were barely passable to get there. Things had not gone smoothly. My mother had lost a significant amount of blood. There was a point, Nettie told me, when it was not clear that either of us would make it through the night. Nettie had stayed until morning. When it was over, when I was alive and my mother was alive, and the sun was coming up gray over the Chapleau River. My mother had held Nettie's hand and said, through everything her body had just been through, that she didn't know how she would ever repay her. Nettie had said not to worry, that it was what she was there for. My mother did not forget. She was not built for forgetting what mattered. Over the years she had tried, on and off, to find Nettie again. She had wanted to send a card, a note, something to show that the girl from that January night was all right. She was never able to locate her. Nettie had moved several times as her own life changed, eventually settling in Ottawa when her health made it necessary, and the distance between them had stayed closed. When my mother was dying, when it was clear that the time was short and getting shorter, she had asked Jonah to come and sit with her on an afternoon when I had gone out to fill her prescription. She told him about Chaplow, about Nettie Gallagher, about the debt she had carried for 34 years and never been able to pay. She asked him that if he ever found Nettie, he would bring her sunflowers, the ones from the garden, and tell her that the baby from that night had turned out well, that she was loved and married and doing fine. She had said, "I don't need her to know my name, I just need her to know it worked out." Jonah had spent the better part of a year finding her. He told me about it on the drive home that night, haltingly, the way he talks when he's been holding something for too long. He had started with the Retired Nurses Association registry and worked outward from there through a long-term care licensing database, and finally through an archivist at a hospital in Timmins who remembered Nettie from a different era and knew she'd ended up somewhere in the Ottawa Valley. He had shown up at Meadowfield Gardens on a Sunday in February, 14 months after my mother died, carrying sunflowers that the florist in Kanata had to special order because sunflowers in February in Ottawa require intention. Nettie had remembered immediately. She had cried. He had been coming back every month since. I want to tell you that the anger dissolved the moment I understood the story. That would be easier to write, and not true. What I felt standing in that room was something more tangled than anger. It was the grief of learning something about my mother, that she had chosen not to give me herself. She had kept this story her whole life. She had not told me about Chaplow, about the January night, about how close it had come. She had shown me her steadiness and her capability and her garden full of sunflowers every summer, and she had not told me about the woman who had made any of it possible. I understood sitting there why she hadn't. She had wanted to be, for me, someone who had always been fine, someone who had never needed saving. On the drive home, I told Jonah that he should have told me. I didn't say it gently, because I wasn't feeling gentle. I told him that 2.5 years of monthly charges and Sunday excuses and a name I had never heard had cost us something real, something I would need time to properly account for. That the love underneath the secret didn't erase the weight of the secret itself. He didn't argue. He didn't try to reframe it or talk me out of what I was feeling. He said, "I know. I kept telling myself I'd find the right time, and then there never was one, and then so much time had passed that I didn't know how to begin. I was scared you'd only hear that I'd been visiting a woman in secret, and not be able to hear the rest of it." "I can hear both things," I said. "I know you can," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't trust that sooner." We did not have a clean reconciliation that night. We had a long dinner and a longer conversation, and some of what I said was hard to hear, and some of what he said took me days to fully sit with. There was a version of this that was simply a husband who had kept a significant secret from his wife for over 2 years, and that version was true, even if it was not the only one. But I also sat with the other version, the one where my husband had spent the better part of a year in his own quiet grief, because he had loved my mother too, in his understated way, tracking down a retired nurse in a long-term care home in Kanata, because a dying woman had asked him not to let someone be forgotten. The one where he drove out there every third Sunday regardless of the weather, in February when it was -24 and the roads were bad, and brought sunflowers from the one shop in the city that would source them in winter, and sat in a small south-facing room and talked to an old woman about me, about how I was doing, about how my mother would have been proud. I had spent 3 years grieving her. He had spent 3 years keeping his promise to her. I went back to Meadowfield Gardens on my own, 3 Sundays later. I brought sunflowers. I called 4 shops before I found one that had them, the same florist in Kanata that Jonah had been using all along, and I sat with Nettie for almost 2 hours. She told me small things about my mother that I hadn't known. The way she'd gripped Nettie's hand through the worst of it. The way she'd said thank you so many times that Nettie had finally told her to save her energy. The way she'd looked at me when it was done, new and very small, and said my full name out loud for the first time. Matilda. After her grandmother. I had never known that part. I had never thought to ask, and she had never offered it, and now here it was, arriving through the hands of a woman I had never met in a warm room in Kanata in January. Before I left, Nettie held my hand the way she apparently had in the first minutes after I was born, and she said, "Your mother made me promise to find you someday, if I could manage it. I never did. I'm glad he managed it for me." Jonah came with me the following month. We sat on either side of Nettie's bed while she showed us the photographs on her dresser, her own grown children scattered across the country, a black and white image of the Chaplot clinic that has long since been converted into something else, her late husband in a park somewhere in the summertime. And in the corner of the dresser, in a small wooden frame I had not noticed on my first visit, there was a photograph of a back garden in summer. Sunflowers in rows along a fence, tall and slightly crooked, facing south. I did not ask where she had gotten it. Some things have an answer that doesn't need to be spoken. Jonah still has the first florist receipt in his wallet. I found it once, folded into a small square behind his health card, and I put it back without saying anything. There are things people carry that are theirs to carry, and I have learned, in the past year, to tell the difference between a secret and a private thing. My mother was a private person. She kept what she needed to keep. She also, it turns out, made sure that the people who mattered to her were looked after in ways she couldn't always explain to me directly. I am still learning to read the shape of how she loved. The sunflowers at Meadowfield Gardens are fresh every third Sunday now, and they come from both of us. Nettie says she can tell which ones I picked because I always choose the ones that are a little taller, and that this is something my mother did too. At the Chaplot flower stall, on the one occasion, Nettie ever saw her buy flowers for herself. I don't know if that's true or if Nettie is simply being kind. I have decided it doesn't matter. Some things become true the longer you let them be.